She had been
Part
coughing
of
that
she
much.
just couldn't get caught
I
up
think
on
I
stuff.
heard someone.
But she
That
was
was
like,
Natalie Keevan, I think.
oh, this
Sorry, what did you
is
say?
the, Joyce just couldn't get caught up on stuff.
Are you taping?
Jennifer,
Yeah.
Okay.
So anybody else in the office that wants it,
It's,
we can.
Oh.
Start.
Can husbands?
Sound about right.
There's no food.
Oh,
And they're okay.
I think that's about right, isn't it?
So,
That's funny.
Joyce
This is how
is
they screened for COVID at UT Southwestern.
And
They
the
do a little
Rachel's
band, and they circle the date on it, so that when you walk in, everybody's supposed to have a uniform band, so.
Amsterdam.
oh, sorry.
Cuz?
Let's put those stickers on people's foreheads and see your.
Do you know the funny thing about Ron and Carol Stewart's daughter, Claire is a civil engineer, and she works on like these floodplains and plans dams and how long they're gonna break and all that, so Ron calls her a dam engineer. Anyway,
I can't,
He tells it better.
she should still be a little kid.
I know,
just,
isn't it amazing?
yeah.
Kinda like this one, she's still be a little kid.
Well, I'm sorry, Britt, I'm trying to get past that.
I know, I still.
You can sit right there.
So we are, because this is where it's being filmed now, which is how she would have done it from the first place, honestly. There's no issue with where
Raise
people
it.
are.
okay.
Yeah, I don't know why we
can
didn't
use this
think of
as a
that.
table to write on.
I just thought like, oh, it should be
I
at the
was
back.
sitting
I
there
don't know
and
why
then
it
I
should have
knew
been at the
someone would
back.
come over here so you can sit there.
I'm good.
Well, maybe you just thought it,
It's
I
not
don't know,
about
if I
us,
hold the
honey.
camera up, I always look better, so, you know, maybe.
That's
And
probably
angles
a
are
factor,
everything.
but of all the other factors,
Angles
it's
are
probably worth it.
everything.
So are we, this is probably it
For tonight.
Zip.
for tonight?
more people, yeah.
So we got a
All right.
quorum, let's vote.
Okay. Well, we are going to study some Revelation, which means we're going to talk about a lot of things. And like, this book is very much tied up in a lot of other kind of discussions. So it's kind of hard to just read it without getting into some of those discussions, because some people will have heard or without necessarily thinking about it absorbed certain interpretations of this book that are just kind of in the back of their mind. From the way they show up in cartoons and books and how people talk about it and different pastors giving different sermons and things. So we're going to start out with some important principles. And if you were here for the good old Nicene Creed deal, to me this book makes no sense unless you just kind of accept Jesus is God, Jesus is human, and as the Nicene Creed says, Jesus will come again with glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. So that's like, part of the creed, that's part of what Christians have been believing since before we even had a written Bible. So the next thing is the legitimacy of revelation as a concept and of the book. So it's a slight play on words there, but basically, like, you have to assume that supernatural prophecy is actually possible. Some people are going to say, no, it's not possible, but I believe that it is prophecy. I believe that the book of Revelation is specifically a prophecy about the future. And I think it was written by John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' 3 top disciples. Other people are going to say it's a different guy named John and just happened to have the name John. I don't think that's the case, but people can disagree with me on that one. But without these two, everything I'm going to say doesn't make any sense. This is actually slightly incidental. I just thought I'd throw it in there. I do think that it is John. So I will be referring to the person who saw the vision as John throughout. I think the author identifies himself as John, but I take that for granted. So another thing that's kind of important to keep in mind. So when he's having visions, some visions, it's like difficult to kind of nail down good vocabulary for it. But so some visions are revealed as like realities. So I tried to make the example of it's kind of like if John's just getting a video feed into his head of future events. But sometimes he's getting visions revealed as symbols, which is images that are referring to different realities. So the most obvious one is when Jesus walks up in chapter 5 of Revelation. He doesn't look like Jesus. He looks like a giant lamb who's bloody because he's been killed. So that's symbolizing the fact that he's the sacrificed lamb who has been sacrificed. He's now up and walking around, which means he's risen again. But the fact that he looks like a lamb means that John is seeing a lamb, but we should all know it's a symbol for Jesus. But in chapter 4 and 5, I would say we get primarily the third kind of category of visions revealed as a mixture of realities and symbols. Because there's a number of things that are said about the lamb that are true of Jesus without really a metaphorical interpretation going on. And we also have a bunch of random figures there. So we've got angels who are running around, we've got people that are running around, and I would say some of those are probably in this first category of he's just seeing what some of these realities look like in heaven, and then he's also seeing images and symbols that represent different realities. So some of it's metaphor, some of it's not, and like teasing through that whole process is where everybody goes 100 different directions with this book, and that's why you've probably heard this book, no one really knows what it means, and it could mean a million different things, and it's actually less complicated than that. There's not a million different interpretations. There's a set of approximately 4 major views based on 4 different kind of chosen perspectives on what the book of Revelation is actually doing, and I will get into that a little bit more. But to just illustrate what I was talking about, let's say John has a vision of a star approaching this green cube. So he could actually see a star moving towards a large green rectangular prism cube thing. That could be what he's actually seeing. He could also see the star in the cube, and it represents, say, God's patience given to people in trials to a church who's enduring something. So the star could represent God's gift, and the cube could represent the church. The star could also represent military action in the air, in the atmosphere, and the cube could represent the effects that the military action is having on the environment. Or the star and the cube could represent a group of people. And then the star is a big, crazy, angelic being that is being symbolized by a star simply because that's an easier symbol to just grab and, keep writing, as opposed to trying to describe, all the different aspects of an angel. Sometimes what John just sees is, that looks like a star, but in reality, in the future, that will be an angelic being. Is this making sense so far? Do you have any questions so far about how I'm trying to frame this? Because so many of the images in Revelation, you have to decide, when it comes off the page, what's actually happening. Because what he's seeing is not necessarily going exactly like the lamb, isn't correspond to reality. Jesus doesn't look like a lamb, he looks like a person. But there's going to be times when he sees people on thrones. He's going to see, people riding around on horses. It's like, is there actually a person on a horse? Or does that horse represent something? Does the person represent something? And we have to tease that out as we're interpreting. So then we also have to confront this fun word here, this word eschatology. Let's say it all together. Eschatology. So eschatology comes from the word eschata, which means last things, last stuff, and ology, which means study of. So we've got the study of last things. So that includes 2 things. One is the theology of what happens when you die, and the theology of how Jesus brings this age to a close. So what we think of as like the apocalypse and Armageddon and Judgment Day, that's part of eschatology. The other part of it is what happens when you die. They're really related, and how you think about them are related. So when they show up in Scripture, when it seems to be addressing one or the other, usually the other is kind of in mind. So let's look at some Bible verses. Just as a thing that I don't think I said, the book of Revelation was written about 90 to 95 AD, which means it's one of the last books of the New Testament to be written. John's letters might have been written later than this, but that's pretty much it. So it's either this or 2nd or 3rd John is the last book written in the New Testament. So it's assuming you have the whole Old Testament and pretty much everything else in the New Testament when it's being written. So it's going to be pulling from all over the place and kind of using imagery from everywhere. So it is a good idea to kind of think through the scriptures that we see showing up. So this is a really common verse. So again, if we're talking about the theology of what happens when you die, and the theology of what happens at the end. This in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 6 through, I have 6 to 10 up there. So we're always of good courage. This is Paul talking to the Corinthians. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So these two lines right here are taken by a lot of people. There's a number of other scriptures elsewhere. This is one of the, I guess, kind of anchor, simplest places where it's expressed. The idea that when you die, you go to be the presence of the Lord. There's another scripture that says, like, when you go into the presence of the Lord. And I didn't pull that one up. But basically, when you die, the idea is if you're a believer, you go be where Jesus is. But your body stays here. But that's really important, that when you die, you go to heaven. You go be with Jesus. That's not the main thing that most of the Bible is talking about when they talk about eternal life or living again or living forever. That is treated as an interim thing. The kind of main focus is on being raised. So your body's down here, your spirit's up in heaven, and at some point those are going to be reunited and raised, or resurrection. In the Nicene Creed, if y'all remember right at the end, it said, I believe in one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. I was about to switch into Apostles' Creed. I acknowledge one baptism for the remission of sins. I look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. That's the second resurrection in the Creed, because the first one's Jesus rising from the dead. The resurrection they're looking for is the resurrection of all Christians. So there's going to be a day when everybody comes back to life. So here's Jesus talking. It's always good to start with Jesus. And I thought I'd just read. So I've got, I think, 35 through 40, and then some verses a little bit down. So it says, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall not thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never cast out, for I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all he has given me, but raise it up on the last day. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him should have eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. And there's actually a fourth time. So these are the first two times in chapter 6. Then it says, truly, truly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever feeds on my flesh, drinks my blood, had eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true blood, and my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. And it goes on to say that whoever eats his flesh and drinks his blood gets to live forever. But we often tend to think more in terms of when I die, I go to heaven, when we're talking about this living forever. We sometimes miss that second part of I'll live forever in heaven, but there is going to be a point where I get to be reunited with my body, same way Jesus was on the third day, and then I get to live immortally in my body. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 15. It says, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep. And as an aside, sleep, talking about Christians sleeping, is a euphemism for death that Jesus kind of invents. He refers to people who have died, but died in faith, and so they're eventually they're either in heaven now or they're going to go to heaven. They're asleep. They're not dead, because death isn't going to have them in the end, is kind of the idea. So we shall not all sleep, as in we shall not all die, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable. We shall not all sleep, but we'll all be changed. The dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on the immortality. So what this is saying is there's going to be a point when everybody who's a Christian who's died comes back to life, and they become imperishable. And then everybody who is still here, they're all going to be changed. Their body, if they're in a perishable body, puts on an imperishable body, which it's not like I take this one off and put a new one on, although there's a couple times when Paul uses that metaphor. More consistently throughout Scripture, it's more like this one goes in the ground, and when it comes back out, God makes it immortal. So it's still this body. Probably scars are disappearing, deformities are ironed out, made straight and whole, and basically every wrong is made right. So people get to be made totally whole and well, and then they're made immortal. Another reference to this is an important one for me, specifically for funerals, I think. But in Thessalonians, Paul is specifically trying to let them know, like, if somebody dies, this is how you should think. This is how Christians specifically are supposed to think when a Christian dies. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep. Again, this is a reference to Christians who have died. That you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. Another way to put it is, we want you guys, Christians, when you grieve for the people that died that are Christians, we want you to grieve with hope. You're still grieving, but you're grieving with hope. But others who do not have the same hope, they're grieving in desperation. When someone dies, that's just it. But we who believe that we're going to have them again, they're in heaven right now, but we also believe we're going to encounter them in the body because we're all going to be raised. We have hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep, i.e. those who have died. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. Apparently, there was an idea that this ties up in some other aspects of the letter to the First Thessalonians, that some people were trying to say, if Jesus comes back, for like whoever's alive when Jesus comes back, they get special privileges, and the people who've already died, they have to like wait in line or wait a while before they get to enjoy being with God. And he's like, no, we who are left until the coming of the Lord, we're not going to precede those who have fallen asleep. We all get there at the same time, because the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore encourage one another with these words. I highlighted that a little bit. So the dead in Christ will rise first, then we who are alive will be caught up together. So that means if somebody's a Christian right now, they die, their body goes in the ground, and they go be with Jesus. And that's great. But there's going to be a time when Jesus comes back, specifically in the air, and that's significant. He doesn't touch down yet. He doesn't touch the ground. He comes back in the air, and he calls up everybody. So that means that if your spirit's in heaven, you actually fly back down into your body. And you get a scene that's kind of like Ezekiel, I think it's Ezekiel 37, where, the song comes from it. It's like the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone. That song originally is talking about bones coming together, because in Ezekiel it says that there's a valley of dry bones. Ezekiel sees this vision, and all these different bones are everywhere, and then God says, speak to them. And when he speaks to them, the bones start snapping together, and then they start getting their sinews and their muscles and their organs and their skin, and then he breathes the breath of life in them, and they're alive again. And that's meant to be a picture of what it's going to be like on the last day when all of these dead Christians come back. That's why Christians historically have always buried their dead rather than burned, because the idea is, I get this back one day. So it's totally fine if a Christian cremates. It's just the idea is, because God can reproduce from a single cell. He could take this carpet and he could turn that into someone's body if he wanted to. He talks about how the Pharisees in the time of Jesus were bragging, we're the descendants of Abraham, so we're like so much better than the Gentiles. And he said, God could raise up sons of Abraham from these stones if he wanted to. Like, he can take any matter and he can transmit it into any other matter that he wants. So if somebody's body, there's no remains left, he'll recreate that body for them. So it's not an issue of, in the valley of dry bones, all the skin is gone, all the sinews are gone, all the muscles are gone, there's just bones. He creates all of that. So any part of you that's missing, God will replace. So that's not really an issue, but there used to be some superstitions about it, that if you weren't buried in the right place, or you weren't, if your body was burned and we couldn't find it and give you a proper burial, you may not come back. So that's superstition. That's silly. Of course, God will be able to restore anyone who actually trusts in Him. But this is where a lot of the idea about needing a proper burial can come from. So it's true. When we die and go to heaven, like, we get to be with Jesus, but there will be a day when we come back, and then we get to fly back up to Him. And that event is called the rapture. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit. There's a little key at the bottom of the notes. It says the rapture. I will get to every part of the handout, because I gave you the things on the handout specifically for good reason. But when we talk about eschatology, there are 5 kind of important things that everybody agrees happens. So the fact that Jesus is in charge, the rule of King Jesus, everybody agrees, if you're a Christian, that that's the case. Everybody agrees there's going to be a final judgment, that there's going to be a resurrection of the dead, that there's going to be a binding of Satan. His power is going to be limited, and then there's going to be a renovation of the universe. I have these nifty little symbols to represent that. So we've got a crown, we've got a gavel, we've got a red arrow going upward, that's dead people coming back to life, some chains for Satan, and then a shiny new planet Earth. So there are 3 major theological positions of how you arrange these. And so I have one, and everything I'm going to say once we kind of finish this discussion will be from that perspective, but I'm exposing you. And a lot of churches teach different ones, and so you may come from a background that has one of these others. I'm going to stick with mine, but there's something called amillennialism, and I just realized I never changed the abbreviations at the top. So there's amillennialism. So it's amillennialism, or amil. And there's really only 2 important points on the timeline. There's when Jesus died and rose again and ascended to heaven, and then when He comes back to earth. And when the Bible will refer to something called the 1,000 years, or the millennium, they treat it as a sort of metaphor for this whole time. In the amil position, you're there. You have no, I just put it there for convenience. It could be here. But we're somewhere on this timeline. And to them, the rule of King Jesus in its fullest extent began once Jesus ascended. They believe the final judgment's going to happen here at the end. They would argue that the resurrection of the dead happens here, that the binding of Satan happened at the cross. That's my first clue of, like, I don't really feel like Satan is bound at the cross, but people are going to argue that. And that the universe is going to be remade over here, new heavens, new earth. New heavens, new earth is the biblical phrase for it, so that will pop up, and I will be referring to that. So that's the amil position. The post-mill position changes it up a little bit. For them, the idea is that Jesus' rule is something that happens gradually over time. The judgment is still at the end, the resurrection is still at the end, but the binding of Satan, the rule of King Jesus, and the renovation of the universe is actually something that we, as Christians sharing the gospel and going around, we pause, and then the millennium is once we have an awesome golden period. We've kind of achieved maximum awesomeness, and then we get 1,000 years of that. And then Jesus comes back to do the judgment and the resurrection of the dead. Then there's the pre-mill position. So if we'll notice real quick, we've got the amil position. That is the idea that we don't really have a millennium, not millenniumism. Then, because it's a metaphor. Then you have post-millennialism, because you have the millennium, and then Jesus comes back. So He's coming back post the millennium. Then you have premillennialism. So pre-mill, again, I should have lengthened them out, but I didn't. Premillennialism, which is the perspective I come from, is that there's this third significant point on the timeline. There's the cross, death, resurrection of Jesus, ascension. We're somewhere in there. Here is the moment that Jesus would return. Then you have 1,000-year millennium, and then here is the judgment day. So we've got the beginning of the rule of King Jesus specifically is fulfilled when he actually lands and touches down and begins to rule for this 1,000 years. Then you get the final judgment at the end. This position is going to say there's actually resurrections on both ends of the millennium. The beginning of everybody who loves Jesus and the end of everybody who doesn't love Jesus. All the way back in Daniel and several times in the New Testament, there's actually reference to the fact that both believers and non-believers will be reunited to their bodies, and those reunited to their bodies and love the Lord get to go into paradise and enjoy this new creation with Jesus. Those who are reunited to their bodies and never follow Jesus are judged and thrown into the lake of fire, or Gehenna, or one of the other biblical metaphors for this outer darkness. The way someone explained it that I always like to include is that everything in the Bible is valid, but another perspective on it is that essentially God is recreating the universe, and you can come if you want, and you don't have to come if you don't want. But if you don't want to come to the new universe, there's no old universe to stay in. You just get pushed out. You can either come to the new universe or not, but there's literally nowhere else to go. And that is the outer darkness to which you are being sent. But you're only going because you didn't want to come to the new universe by submitting to Jesus. So that's just an aside. But the premill position has Satan being bound at the beginning of the millennium because Jesus is on earth. He binds him. He says, you can't do anything. And this is like paradise on earth for 1,000 years before he remakes the world. I also subscribe to a niche is not the right word because lots of people believe this, but a tweaked version of this where we add yet another important point on the timeline. And now it's going to start looking a little bit more like the one that I gave y'all. Because we've got the return of King Jesus right here. We've got the judgment right here. We also have judgment going on during this tribulation. Then we get resurrections at each of these 3 points. We get the binding of Satan at the beginning of the millennium, and we get the renovation of the universe. So here is the chart that I gave y'all, but in negative. I made it white so you can see it because the rest of the PowerPoint's black. So we've got the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension. We're in here somewhere. This age, up until this moment, is usually called the church age. Then we get the beginning of the tribulation. That's when I believe the rapture takes place. And we'll talk about what the rapture is. There's a 7-year tribulation split into 2 5-year, 3 and 3.5 year halves. Then we've got the physical return of Jesus with all the Christians. 1,000-year millennium. We've got final judgment and an end of all death and sin and evil, and it's all done away with. If we zoom in on this tribulation, I believe the tribulation is characterized by the beginning is the church is gone. Everybody who loves Jesus is gone. The world starts going crazy. Actually, Satan is unleashed on the world in a way that he's not been before. He empowers the rise of a figure we call the Antichrist. Up until halfway through, this figure declares himself to be God and starts forcing everyone in the world to worship him. Then he is going crazy, attacking people, persecuting Christians, persecuting Jews, trying to wipe out the Jewish people. There's a lot of people who thought that Hitler might be the Antichrist. He's not, because none of this has happened yet, but the rapture hasn't happened yet, so we know it wasn't. But someone like that, who hates the Jewish people, it specifically says is going to come. But his authority also decreases as more and more of the judgments of God start coming and coming against him. Then Jesus returns and specifically kills the Antichrist, and then starts ruling the world for the millennium. So that's y'all's kind of basic timeline. And I think this basic timeline guides our movement through the book of Revelation. Now, there's going to be other people who are going to be like, no, we just need, this. But I've got a lot more points on my timeline where I think that things fit in, and I think that they're sequential. But someone who holds to an all-mill position, a lot of things I'm going to make argument about sequences of time and 7-year period, things like that, doesn't really make sense in their framework because they've already assumed the next important thing on the timeline is Jesus coming back judging the world, raising the dead, making the universe new. And it's sort of a position that intentionally rejects, for legitimate reasons. I'm not saying that they have no legitimate reasons, I just disagree with them. But they don't think anything about this construct is, where did my mouse go? They don't think this is valid. They want to erase all of that and say, we are reading too literally into some of these numbers and these events and different things, that they should be taken as spiritual truths, describing what the whole church age is like, what, that the 7-year tribulation, what they'll describe here is what's happening all through church history. That the Antichrist figure is actually just a archetype of every political leader that tries to bring a false religion or tries to persecute the church. And that the rapture does not reflect us physically leaving our bodies. That reflects us converting. And then when Jesus returns, that's this end of the timeline here. So they're going to, what people will say, spiritualize a lot of these texts. And I don't mean to say that in a negative way. I feel like that word is often used negatively. I don't agree with this interpretation. So I'm going to teach from a dispensational pre-mill position. A pre-tribulational dispensational pre-mill position. Because I got all the words. But I think this is a valid timeline, valid interpretation. And this is kind of what we're going to go with. Are there any questions from here? Anything that stood out as like, that didn't make any sense? You're crazy.
What denominations tend to go with Amil?
Okay, that's valid. That's worth thinking about. So Catholics are pretty much officially Amil, but Roman Catholics will be all over the place as far as this on a more popular level. This view, this dispensational premillennialism view, is very popular in the United States, particularly because of the Scofield Reference Bible. A number of revivalists who were active at this in the late 1800s, early 1900s. A bunch of the Christian schools that were started in the early 1900s held this view, and specifically were started to promote this view. So like Dallas Theological Seminary was one of those. Biola University in California was one of those. It's not just to promote this view, it's to promote a way of doing theology that includes this system, but because it's a little bit bigger than that, but mostly non-denominational churches are going to hold to a pre-dispensational or pre-tribulational dispensational kind of view. But it's really popular, and it's even popularized through things like the Left Behind series. So people at a lay level a lot of people are going to accept this, even if their official denomination doesn't. But officially, Roman Catholic Church is Amil. The Lutherans are typically going to be Amil. Presbyterians are almost exclusively Amil, to the point where one time they wrote it in that premillennialism was a heresy. And I don't agree with that because it's, the creed doesn't talk about it. You can't say that everybody has always thought that premillennialism was wrong until we got to recently. This is actually it's a whole thing, but we could go into why parts of this are actually very old, and it's a kind of a campaign the last 100 years, actually mostly 50 years, to try to say that anybody who holds to this kind of framework is no one thought about this until the 1800s, which is just not true. But there is a guy who's famous. His name is John Nelson Darby, who's famous for kind of creating a clear system of thinking about this and publishing on it. But elements of this go back to the 1st century. So, and in one of my classes, my professor spent like 3 class periods basically just doing that, because it was kind of his axe to grind of like people accusing him this is a recent view, so it's not as anyway. But so most of the major, Roman Catholicism and most of the major denominations are going to be Amil. Baptists characteristically are very promote, like in non-essentials, lots of liberty, so they're going to be all over the place, but traditionally they're going to be more pre-mill. If you are Reformed, which means like kind of Calvinist-y, and that's becoming more and more common in a lot of Baptist churches. So like Matt Chandler is part of this new wave of kind of reformed Calvinisty way of thinking. John Piper, Francis Chan, David Platt. There's a lot of them. They're gonna lean more Amil, and it's a little bit. It's almost trendy right now to poo-poo on premillennial and become Amil, but there's always, trends.
What about post-mill? Is that falling out of favor of
So
sort?
post-mill, because if you'll notice, post-mill, the idea is that the church is going to essentially create what here is accomplished by. This is not changing the way I thought it would. Here, this is like heaven on earth because Jesus is literally on earth ruling as the king. So he was ruling the world, and he's teaching people how to turn deserts into gardens and teaching people how to raise animals. And Isaiah talks about how actually like children are going to play with dangerous animals because of Jesus' presence, are no longer going to hurt people. Lions and lambs aren't going to hurt each other. Lambs will lay down with lions and children will play with snakes and things. And so the idea is that there's not going to be a ton of death that goes on here. There will be death. That it's made clear that there is death, but people live in a super long amount of time. You're thought of as unlucky if you don't live past 100. So everybody's going to live past 100 except a couple unlucky people. Unlucky is not exactly the word they use, but yeah. So this is amazing and glorious and wonderful. And post-millennialism has the idea that we're basically going to create that through humanity more and more just accepting the gospel in the way it does business, in the way it does government, in the way it does all kinds of things. And we're going to create paradise on earth for about 1,000 years before Jesus comes back. And basically this was very popular when people were also extremely optimistic about scientific progress and nation states rising in Europe and all this stuff. And then World War I dealt a pretty heavy blow to this. World War II, basically, it didn't kill it, but like all of the major proponents of this. So there were a lot of people actually in some of the denominations like Presbyterianism, Lutheranism, things like that. It was very popular in Europe and the Americas during the late 1800s, early 1900s, very early 1900s to be post-mill, and then suddenly became not very popular with World War I, very unpopular with World War II. It's kind of been revised and revived under the idea that it's not going to be through necessary governmental systems and things like that. It's just, we're going to keep sharing the gospel, and there's going to be a point at which every single person in the world accepts the gospel. And once everybody's accepted the gospel, then we'll learn how to work together. Then we'll learn how to do all of this, and then we'll bring about paradise on earth. But not a ton of people really hold the post-mill view anymore. It's just one of the three major ones, so it's always worth discussing and kind of showing the picture of it, because it's almost kind of a halfway between all-mill and pre-mill position. But a lot of people aren't very post-mill anymore. But there are a number of small but influential church groups that get really involved in politics around the time of every election, and particularly put out a ton of stuff about why it's essentially, everybody would agree that it'd be nice if the president was Christian, but they're particularly will talk about how the president needs to be Christian, because specifically from their point, we need a Christian in every political office because we're trying to make the government Christian because they're trying to do this. And I'm all for bringing more of Christ and more of the ethics of the Bible and the values into political offices. I just don't think we're going to be able to do this, because I don't think we get heaven on earth until Jesus actually comes back right here. But I'm all for it. There are groups that explicitly are engaging in politics specifically because they think they can get their post-mill millennium going. But I don't, good for you. If it gets you involved in politics, I just think you're wrong. So we're talking about the study of last things. So I titled this part, the seven last things. So if you're going to go dispensational premillennialism with this timeline, these are some descriptions that I'm just going to read and we can just talk about. But I just wrote these as sort of a summary, and I didn't include them on the notes because they were essentially completed after I had already sent them to my mom to reprint. But so we've got the rapture, and I gave you a little short definition of the rapture at the bottom of your page, but this is kind of a fuller one, and so I'll just read it. According to Paul, there is a future moment when Christ will return in the air. He's not going to touch the ground, because when he touches the ground is at the end of the tribulation. But he's going to return in the air to raise all the Christian dead, and then to gather every believer into heaven. So everybody who's a believer who's dead comes back to life, and then every believer, those who were dead and those who are not yet dead, all are gathered into heaven. All Christians receive their glorified bodies and await the end of the tribulation, which is about 7 years, when Jesus will physically return to the earth. Any questions about that, by the way?
That sounds like a big party.
I think it is a big party, but I think it'll be very fun.
I think it will be.
Everybody gets back together. I have been asked this by multiple people. I am convinced that when we see each other, we will recognize one another. Jesus does say that in the resurrection, there will be no marriage. So there is going to be a point when, because marriage it served its purpose. It was to fill the earth, and now the earth will be full. So Jesus says that in the resurrection, we won't be married anymore. But that's actually kind of good, because if you think about it, I mean,
That's good.
Well, the kind of love that marriage is supposed to picture between a husband and a wife is actually going to be shared amongst all mankind at that point. But also, but not in a sexual way. It transcends that. But then, but the closeness of it, the commitment of it, we will all be united as Christ's bride to one another and to Christ. But then also, if you think about it, if I marry Becky, let's say her name is, and she dies, and then I marry, because I can get remarried because she's died, but then I marry someone named Jennifer. I did not mean to pick a name in someone else. I was trying to pick a totally random name, and Jennifer was the next thing that came into my head. So let's say Alicia. So Becky died, and then Alicia. I marry Alicia, and then I die, and let's say she marries Tom. Who's married to who?
Exactly.
When we all come back to life.
We're all married to each other.
But if marriages are just over when you die, and then when we come back to life, we're just not married anymore, we all just love one another, and we have no longer a need for a life partner we can commit to because we all experience that with everyone and with Christ. It's like, that's all done away with, and there's no messiness, which is nice. Actually, there's a story where the Sadducees come up to Jesus, and they're like trying to trick him. And they're like, because they don't believe in the resurrection. They don't think it's going to happen. And they're like, Jesus, in the resurrection, what if a woman marries a brother, and then he dies, and she marries his brother, and there's actually 7 brothers, and each of them die in sequence, and she marries all of them. Who will she be married to in the resurrection? Because we're not going to have polygamy, are we? And he's like, you fool, don't you know? It's kind of funny. Like, there's no marriage in the resurrection, because they're going to be like angels. So that's also where we get a clue that, like, oh, angels don't marry each other. But anyway, that's a fun tangent. It is going to be a party. It's going to be a wonderful party. We get everybody back. And that is what Paul was talking about. We should encourage one another when we see Christians die, because we really do mourn the loss, but we mourn with a hope that we are going to be part of this party. We are going to see them again because they're going to be raised, which is great. So the rapture kicks off something called the tribulation. Jesus refers to the Great Tribulation. So after the rapture, what Jesus called the Great Tribulation will begin and last for 7 years. It's about 7 years. I'm not going to press it that it has to be exactly down to the second, but it refers to units of time that seem to add up to 7 years. And elsewhere, it also refers to it being 7 years long. But if it's 7 years and 3 days, I'm not going to freak out. But the human population will undergo judgments intended for 2 purposes. First, these judgments punish sin and give evil people and governments their just recompense. This is the time when God's like, y'all you get what you deserve. But there's a second purpose. It's that these judgments give an ever-increasing evidence of God's existence and his desire to reconcile with anyone who trusts in Jesus. Because a constant, resounding thing throughout the entire book of Revelation is that there are sometimes eagles, sometimes angels, sometimes people with the powers of the prophets from the Old Testament, there's just constantly people who are preaching, there's judgment coming, repent. So all throughout the book of Revelation, every time something bad is happening, it's getting announced and people are given the opportunity, turn to God and you will be saved from this. Or it's actually not always promised that they'll be saved from it. Sometimes it's like turn from God, and then if the thing kills them, they'll then go be with Jesus. But so people still might die during this time period. There's actually a ton of Christians who died. Well, Christians. I try to use the word believer because in my mind, Christians are the people that come back to life when Jesus returns. So just to be clean, the people before the rapture, they're all in heaven. But this event, the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation, is going to trigger faith in a bunch of people. Probably a bunch of people that were on the fence before, and suddenly all their family's gone. And it's like, dang, that was real. I need to believe now. And so that's going to be what's needed to kind of urge a bunch of people. So there is going to be a bunch of people that become Christians right at the beginning of this, or become believers. So I'll use tribulation saints or tribulation believers is what a lot of times they're called, or I'll call them. People who are believing during the tribulation. And they also are very active in preaching. And we know that there's at least two of them that have a very active preaching ministry to Jewish believers, and that a bunch of Jewish people become Christians. But a lot of them die. So there's the next thing is the Antichrist. This is I'm talking about kind of the 7 big important things according to a dispensational premillennial perspective. We've got the rapture, we've got the tribulation, and during the tribulation we've got the rise of the Antichrist. So it says, during the tribulation, a satanically empowered individual called the Antichrist will experience a meteoric rise in political and military power until he holds worldwide influence. This individual will declare himself to be divine and will use his authority to persecute all who do not worship and serve him. New converts to Christ will experience particularly heavy oppression and martyrdom during this period. So a lot of these people that are becoming Christians are becoming so at their own peril, and they're executed for it. But that's okay, because it talks about in there, there's a special blessing for those that are actually killed during this time for their faith because they follow Jesus. But we then get what I'll call the second advent, or the return. So I like the term second advent because it matches the first advent. So like when we celebrate Advent season, that's celebrating the first advent that Jesus was born. He lived, he died, he rose again, and then he left. And now we've got a second advent that we're waiting for, or the second coming that we're waiting for, or the return. But Christ will physically return at the end of the 7-year tribulation. He will personally kill the Antichrist. Scripture actually indicates that he does so by speaking a word at him. We don't know what he's going to say, but there's a word or a phrase or a sentence he's going to say, and the Antichrist dies. He will personally kill the Antichrist and will begin ruling as the monarch of the world. All glorified Christians who've been partying up in heaven will return from heaven with him, and any martyrs from the tribulation will resurrect and receive glorified bodies in that moment. Satan is then bound and prevented from tempting anyone for 1,000 years, which raises the question of who is he tempting, which will be addressed right here. So the 5th major point is the millennium, this 1,000-year period. Christ's monarchy over the world will remain unchanged for 1,000 years. Converts to Christ who survives the tribulation will repopulate the earth and live mortally, while glorified Christians live immortally. So there's going to be 2 different kinds of people. There's going to be the Christians who already have their glorified bodies, running around like Jesus, who's in his glorified body, ruling the world. And it talks about how we will literally be administrators over cities or over counties or doing secretary work for him or whatever. We'll have jobs. We'll be doing things. It'll be, we'll be full of joy. We'll have no pain. We can't die. We're constantly going to have communion with Jesus and presence with him, but we'll have jobs as we're running around the world. And the people who converted to Christ who don't die during the tribulation, there's a number of them, who knows how many there are, but they're going to actually start repopulating the world. And they're going to be running around, they're physical and mortal. So if they trip over and fall, they might hit their head and get sick. Jesus could come down and zap them and heal them. I don't know that he's going to do that automatically for everyone, but he could. And again, this is where I was talking about how if somebody dies at an age younger than 100, people will consider them, have died tragically in their youth, because people are expected to live for most of this period. Talks about how lifespans get to 700, 800, 900 years, but people are having tons of children and people are repopulating the planet. The millennial kingdom is primarily characterized by peace, by physical restoration of the natural environment, and by surpluses of foods and goods. It's just, if a king came to the earth and did everything right and everything was perfect, because the perfect king is coming to do it. Then we've got the final judgment. So it's not just the final judgment. There's a little bit of also the final temptation, I guess, because it talks about in the book of Revelation that after ruling for 1,000 years on earth, Christ is going to allow Satan out. He's going to allow him to tempt the mortal population one more time. Then Christ will cast Satan into the eternal lake of fire. Christ will raise every unrighteous person and judge them according to their deeds and then cast them into the lake of fire. And depending on who you ask, there may or may not be some people who love Jesus or loved God in the Old Testament, or somebody who have not been raised yet but still might go to heaven. And so this would be where those people are. I would be under the impression that either at the rapture or at the end of the tribulation, when the tribulation saints are resurrected, that's when those people would make it, Adam and David, people like that. But some people think, for example, that Old Testament people don't get resurrected till here. I don't know. It doesn't say specifically, so we don't know, but it could be either. But the temptation, which I did go into right here, the temptation that Satan prompts him to is actually to start a rebellion. He starts a rebellion against Jesus and gathers what is understood to be a pretty massive army outside the gates of Jerusalem where Jesus is king. And then fire falls from heaven and just consumes the whole army and they're just dead. So it's like, okay, we're dead. Then all the unrighteous people are raised and judged. Then we get the new heavens and the new earth, which, one of my personal pet peeves, is that everybody assumes this just means God selects the whole universe, he hits delete, and he starts over. And that could be how it happens. I just don't think that's how it happens. I think that he remakes the universe, or he makes the universe new. Kind of like the difference between, am I going to crash and total my car and throw it away and then build a new car, or do I take the car that's broken, I iron out every single piece, I completely redo it, and now it's perfect and made new. Renovated versus recreated, or yeah. So people are going to argue both sides of this. I mean, academic professors will write journals about it and stuff, journal articles. So I lean towards the idea that he's recreating it, but that he's renovating it rather than recreating it. But when it talks about how he is recreating the world, is it brand new or is it made brand new? But anyway, so it says, once every fallen angel or demon and every unrighteous human is in the lake of fire, all sin and death is purged. Christ will unite the visible reality of our universe with the invisible reality of heaven. The resulting new heavens, new earth with God and humanity in perfect relationship will be beautiful, complete, and good, and awesome forever. So, those 7, I had the rapture starts the 7-year tribulation, during which the Antichrist runs around and kills a bunch of people. Then, he's killed, and the tribulation's ended when Jesus comes back in the second advent. He rules for 1,000 years during what we call the millennium, or the millennial kingdom. Then Jesus judges everybody at the end, and in my opinion, we keep going on earth, but now heaven has been brought to earth, and the very nature of reality is different, because what was invisible before is visible now. That's why I think it's new. If you remember in the Creed, because we can keep referencing that, it says, I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. So the idea is that there is a visible reality and an invisible reality. And I think that it's at the end that those things are brought together in union. So that's a lot of stuff we've talked about before we've actually gotten to Revelation itself. Which, I mean, I don't know how long we want to go tonight. So it's 7:30 right now. We theoretically said we were going to do 6:30 to 8.
We did.
But do we actually want to go that long?
I'm good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another 30.
All right. So I want to start with the fact that Revelation actually records 7 blessings in it. And the first is a blessing for people who study the book of Revelation. After that is a blessing on anyone who dies in the Lord. So anybody who dies while believing in Jesus, they're blessed. Anyone who dies, or not dies, anyone who stays awake and clothed. And this evokes the idea that Jesus has talked about how, there's the parable of the virgins. There's the 10 virgins, 5 of them who are awaiting at nighttime with their candles and their oil, and they're ready. And then there's 5 that don't. But there's a number of different parables that talk about how the bridegroom is going to come at nighttime. So this is essentially saying people who are staying awake, staying ready, staying dressed, clothed in the sense of like they're dressed and ready for it, who are looking for Jesus to come back. There's a blessing on those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb. The wedding supper of the Lamb is described as essentially the beginning of the millennium, when all the resurrected believers are together having a party with Jesus, and Jesus has landed on earth. So anyone who's invited to that is blessed, which would be anyone who's placed their faith in Jesus. There's a blessing on anyone who shares in Jesus' resurrection. So Jesus died and rose again, and anybody who has died believing in Jesus, when he comes into the air, they get raised. And then anybody who is alive then, they get glorified, so there is a sense in which they're sharing in that first resurrection. There is the tribulation saints that come back at the end of the tribulation, and then wherever the Old Testament people, whether that's in the rapture, whether that's when the tribulation saints come back to life, or at the end of the millennium, they all are described as essentially sharing in this first resurrection. There's a blessing for keeping the words of the book of Revelation. So if it says, watch out, stay clothed and awake, be ready. And then the last one is blessing for washing one's robe. And this one could be taken 2 different ways. One is essentially a metaphor for the idea that you got baptized, which itself is a metaphor for the fact that you've decided that you love Jesus. So this is essentially would be a blessing for becoming a Christian. But another way to take it is the idea that your clothes are made dirty by your sin, and then you go wash them. You go back to Jesus. Let's say it's sort of like he's a river that you can keep going back to and washing your clothes every time they get dirty. So this isn't necessarily saying blessed are those who stay clean their whole lives. It's blessed are those who every time they are dirty, they go wash them. So it's somebody who is constantly seeking the Lord, depending on the Lord for forgiveness. Someone who is keeping short accounts with him. And notice none of these blessings are like, you're not saved if you don't do this. This is saying, you're going to be happy. You're going to be blessed if this is what you do. So I feel like it's saying, study the book of Revelation. Keep hope, because even if you die in the Lord, you're going to be blessed. But look for what's going to happen in this book. Look for Jesus to come back. Be alert and ready. Be excited for the fact that you're going to get to be reunited with everyone and be reunited with Jesus. You are going to come back to life, and everybody you know is going to come back to life. So keep holding on to what's in this book, and keep a short account with the Lord, because he could come back at any moment. So those are the blessings in Revelation. So now it's 7:30, so we can go into the first chapter and read through that. And I do not have. Oh, one thing I didn't go over, so I'll go over real quick on the handout. So we will not go into the first chapter yet. But one thing I just want to point out, between my timeline up here and my key terms down at the bottom, I've got an outline of the book. So I just kind of wanted to go over that real quick, and I forgot to add that to my PowerPoint. But the first chapter is essentially an introduction. So if we read that tonight, we'll kind of see. This is when Jesus appears to John and basically tells him, I'm me. John faints, and Jesus has to wake him up and say, don't be afraid. And then tells him, I'm going to write some letters, and then I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And I'm going to give you some keys on how to interpret this book. Then in chapters 2 and 3, we get the letters to the churches. And I believe those are churches that were, like churches at that time. Some people are going to say, when it says the church of Pergamum, that's really referring to the church of the 700s. And when it says the church of Laodicea, that's referring to present day. I don't really think that that's a valid way of reading the book. I think that these are actually people that were alive at the time of John that needed these corrections and these encouragements and these warnings from Jesus. So he gives warnings, he gives commendations where he's like, I'm so proud of you for doing this, but it'd be really great if you did this. Or, you guys are lifeless, and I'm probably, wake up, or I'm going to take away your lampstand, which means basically your church is going to fall apart. But we've got those letters. Then chapters 4 and 5 are visions of heaven. So it could be present, it could be future, but we see God the Father. He's enthroned. He's surrounded by many angels and many beings. They're called elders. We don't know if those are angels or Christians or somebody else. But then the Lamb, which is Jesus, appears and receives from God a scroll. Then chapters 6 to 8, it's actually just like the first couple verses of chapter 8, but I said that. You get a series of judgments that are as a result of each seal that Jesus breaks. So the idea is that it's a scroll that has seals down the side of it. So when you pour wax and then you stamp it, the idea is that whoever stamps it, that seal represents a person who has authority, and only someone with equal authority can break it. You're not allowed to, because if the king stamped it and you're not the king, or you're not one of the king's chosen people, you can't break that seal and see what's on the inside. So there's this big question at the beginning of chapter 5 of, who can open the scroll of 7 seals? No one's worthy because God has this scroll. Who has equal authority to God to open his scroll? And then the Lamb shows up, and then the Lamb starts opening the seals. Jesus is God. It is a constant kind of refrain in this book, is that Jesus is God. But that's what the seals are doing, is that there's 7 seals before you're able to open the scroll. So as he breaks each of the seals, we get these different judgments. Then there's, in chapter 8, we switch, and now we've got 7 trumpets. And each time someone blows a trumpet, different judgments are happening. And I've got some trumpets there. But one thing that's interesting is that the seals, there's a lot of war and hardships that are multiplying, and then many believers are being killed. When we talk about the 7 trumpets, you see specifically that there are moments when the believers are being protected, and unbelievers are the ones that are specifically suffering a lot of these judgments. Then chapter 12 is probably one of the most argued about chapter in this book. Maybe chapter 20, maybe chapter 12. One of those two. Chapter 12, we get this vision in heaven, or it's a sign in heaven, where there's a woman, and there's a dragon, and there's a baby, and what does it even mean? I think it specifically is referring to the fact that after the rapture, Satan attacks Jews who are alive, and any people who come to faith in Jesus during the tribulation. Then in chapter 13, we get the 2 beasts. There's these visions of this large beast that comes from the sea and the beast that comes from the earth. And I think that refers to the Antichrist arising in his political power, and we'll talk about it, and the false prophet arising. And the false prophet is a religious figure who enforces worship of the Antichrist. Then 14 to 16 is the 7 bowl judgments. So the 7 bowls seem to be particularly targeted at the Antichrist followers suffering judgments, and the Antichrist followers are preparing for war. But then there's also just kind of general, what's the word I'm looking for? Environmental destruction going on. And then 17 to 18 are specifically devoted to the fall of Babylon. And their Babylon seems to be representing the capital city of the Antichrist and the economic power of that city and of that empire. So then that's destroyed. And then 19 and 20, Jesus comes back and rules his kingdom. So he sets up his kingdom, and then he has the final judgment. Then 21 and 22 talk about the new heavens, new earth, where those are uniting, and then we don't have sin or death anymore. And then there's a little bit at the end that's sort of like, so it's awesome that you read this book. So we'll be moving through it. We're not going to go chapter by chapter through it, but I think chapter 1 deserves a week. 2 and 3 can deserve some attention together. We'll probably not spend a ton of time on 4 through 11. We might do all of that in 1 week. 12 and 13 are probably a week. 14 to 20 might be a week. It might just be 14 to 18. And then 19, 20, 21, 22 might be 1 or 2 weeks. So that's something like 7 or 8 weeks that we'd be looking at. But halfway through, I might realize that doesn't make any sense, and we might adjust course. So I reserve the right to not have to stick with that exactly. But are there any questions? Any thoughts? If that's crazy, that makes no sense. You're insane.
I like this outline. It's helpful.
This
to kinda
helpful?
see, yeah.
Okay. Because I think that's one thing with this is it can sometimes feel like you're getting lost in like these angels doing things. It's like this is a structure. So if you're in the middle of chapter 10 and you're like, what's going on? You're in the middle of the 7 trumpets. So it's like I hope that this outline can be helpful for you. So one thing that is worth addressing before we go to chapter 1 is I also have these bowls. The idea is that the bowls have judgments in them. So did you see my animation? So we've got a bowl, it's tilting and pouring out judgments. The little flames.
I love it.
But the reason that I animated it is because we've got 3 kind of scenarios we need to talk about. Because if you notice, there's 3 important sets of 7 here. The 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. And there's going to be debate about how this works. But there's kind of 3 main possibilities. Scenario 1, 2, and 3 is that we've got the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, each describing the 7 years independently. Like
Going on concurrently.
concurrently. Another one is that the seals are describing the whole 7 years, and then the trumpets and the bowls are sequential. Or scenario, but you could move any of these 3 to this box. Or you've got a third scenario where all 3 sets are sequential. So I've also made that visual for us because that can be helpful. So we can have the Great Tribulation, Millennium, right? Rapture, Return of Jesus, Final Judgment. But during the Tribulation, you could have the 7 seals. Then, this would be they're all running concurrently. Then you have the 7 trumpets. Then you have the 7 bowls. But actually, I was going to point out, if you hold this view, the 7 bowls are confined to the last half, if not smaller than that. It might just be the last year of the 7 years or something like that. You could also have the 7 seals, and then it's like 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, in one after the other. And then the same thing with a third scenario where you've got seals, trumpets, bowls. So I think I like this one. I was this one until I took a class last year and my professor talked me into this one. And then I decided I think I'm more this one
As you prepared.
As I prepared for my Thursday night Bible study with the men's Bible study I'm part of, I was leading them through Revelation. We're in the middle of it, but I think we're about to get to like chapter 16 or something like that. So we're farther along. But some of this PowerPoint was developed to help them. And it's been reworked to be for
I
y'all.
thought you did it in like 4 days.
Hey,
But so
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
Just maybe it's not worth answering, but so is it primarily those scenarios, time units, or things sort of happening which cause the next thing to happen?
so that would be this one,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I can see the argument. I mean, like I thought this until my professor explained why he thought that is the case for those two, but not the case for the seals.
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
And then when I applied the same logic on this next time going through it with my Bible study, I'm like, I think I like this better.
Let's go.
But it's not necessarily the case, and I do want to make that clear, that like the third seal and the third trumpet correspond. What I actually think is the case is that the 7 seals describe the 7 years. That the first seal, for example, I have a little animation of the seals. Let me just show you. Because I feel like the seals are the most symbolic of them. So when you break the first seal, you get an angel who says, "Come," and we get a rider on a white horse who has a crown and a bow, and he goes out to conquer. What I think this seal is actually saying, I think that this is a symbol for the fact that there is going to be a political leader who arises and amasses a lot of political and military power. I think this is saying essentially we're going to get the Antichrist figure is going to start ruling, is going to start rising. Because of him, in his wake, there's going to be a massive amount of war. So when you break the second seal, there's actually an angel that says, "Come," and there's a red horse with a guy in military gear carrying a sword. And it says that he takes peace from the earth. So I don't think this is necessarily a person. I think this represents the fact that in the wake of the rise of the Antichrist, war starts becoming the norm all over the planet. Then,
You think number 1, the white horse, is the Antichrist?
I don't even necessarily think that this is the Antichrist.
Okay.
As much as I would say, I think this represents that the Antichrist is going to start gaining political power. Because I already independently, because of a number of other scriptures, more than we've even talked about, think that the Antichrist is a person who arises in the end times to oppose God's throne, claims to, be God, and then is killed by Christ at the end. There's references to it in Isaiah. There's references to it in Daniel. In both of the books of Thessalonians, Jesus even talks a little bit about it in Matthew 25. So I already think that the Antichrist is specifically a figure, and I think that this seal means the Antichrist is going to start gaining power. I think that as a result of his power, there's going to be a lot of war. But it's also possible that each of these are demonic entities. So it could be that the demonic entity that empowers the Antichrist figure is the guy on the white horse, and that now a demonic entity who is going to convince the nations to go to war is going to start running around doing that.
So right at the first, when you were talking about symbols and the star and the cube,
Yes.
so John's seeing
John
that,
is
he's
seeing
writing it,
a guy on a white horse with a crown and a bow. So that could be that there is a guy on a white horse with a crown and a bow. I think it's more likely that what he saw represents either a demonic entity that empowers the Antichrist, or the Antichrist is going. It just means the Antichrist is going to arise.
Okay, thank you.
Then again, he sees a man on a red horse. I think John is actually seeing this, but I think what he's seeing means either a demonic entity who is empowered to create wars going out and doing that, or just demons in general are involved in the Antichrist's rise to power, and that in the wake of the rise of the Antichrist, there's going to be a lot of war. I also think that here in the third one, there's a rider on a black horse who's carrying scales, and there's a quote after him that it's about prices of food in a market that seems to imply that in the wake of the Antichrist's rise, in the war that happens, massive economic downturn and famine and loss of life is a result. But there could also be a demonic entity who does these things, so I'm not excluding that possibility. But I don't think these are necessarily happening like first year, second year, third year, fourth year. I just think that what it's saying is the tribulation is going to be characterized by the rise of the Antichrist, characterized by worldwide war. I think it's going to be characterized by the horrible economic, results of war, and lots of death. So it says the last rider, the rider of the pale or green horse, was death, and he's followed by Hades, and he goes around and he'll kill a quarter of the human population with disease or wild beasts or war or famine. So there could be a demonic entity empowered to just go around killing a bunch of people. Or it just represents that in the rise of the Antichrist over the course of these 7 years, there's going to be a lot of people that die in a lot of different ways. The fifth one is interesting because it doesn't release necessarily a judgment. It shows that there is a altar of God in heaven, and under that altar are a bunch of spirits of people who died during the tribulation period for loving Jesus. And they cry out to God and say, God, how long will our blood be unavenged? When are you going to avenge us for being killed for following you? And God says, wait just a little longer. Your number is not completed yet. There's more people that need to die for the name of Jesus before I avenge your blood. And they're like, okay. That's the fifth seal. So that's interesting. So the way I would interpret that is the tribulation is characterized by lots of Christians dying and lots of people who are coming to Christ during the tribulation being executed for it, or in some sense dying for their faith. The sixth seal goes with the typical, what I like to call celestial darkening. There's a number of times in Scripture where it talks about the sun going dark, or the moon going to blood, or the stars going dark, or the sky being darkened. It says there's an earthquake, so it's regulated. And then it says the sun goes dark, the moon turns to blood, and then the stars are darkened or fall from the sky. I think one or the other. And then the seventh seal, it actually just says, so this is just, I just have noise here so that I could represent the noise going away. Because it says the seventh seal is represented by 30 minutes of silence in heaven.
Wow.
Which...
They say there's no women in heaven right now.
So,
Because of silence.
so it's distinctly possible that, when these demonic entities go out, if they're demonic entities, that all happens, and there's a celestial darkening that's going on, and there's a silence in heaven, and then we go to the next judgments. Or it could be, this is the 7 years leading up to the return of Jesus, and now let's step back in time, and we're going to describe the 7 years from another perspective, now with the 7 trumpets. So the 7 trumpets talks about how there's some blood rain and fire, that 33% of the land, 30% of the trees, and 100% of the grass all gets burned up. There is a mountain that is supposed to fall from heaven on fire and turn a third of the sea to blood, and then a third of the sea creatures die and a third of ships are destroyed. So those two things in particular make me ask a question. It's distinctly possible that there's a large fiery mountain that God is going to throw at the earth to cause the sea to turn to blood.
Meteorite?
It could be a meteorite. It could also be a large engine of war, like a large spacecraft, a large aircraft, that when it falls into the ocean over the course of these wars leads to mass pollution, leads to a number of people dying, leads to a lot of ships being destroyed. It also talks about how there's a star that's supposed to fall into the rivers and springs of the earth, or a third of them, and poison them. And so you get rivers becoming poisonous, springs becoming poisonous. So if you think about nuclear war, it's possible that the nuclear war is leading to freshwater supply being poisoned. These could be effects of the war that we were talking about with Seal 2, that the war was ever increasing, and Seal 3, that death and famine were happening. And Seal 2, 3, and 4 is the famine and the death. So it's possible they're sequential. It's also possible that these are reflecting the 7 years. Over the course of the 7 years, fresh water is poisoned. The sea, many things are destroyed. Things are falling from the sky and stuff's getting destroyed. And then once again in Seal 4, or Trumpet 4, we actually get another celestial darkening. But here it's a third of the sun, a third of the stars, and a third of the moon. And then it says that a third of the daytime and a third of the nighttime there's no light and it's darkened. One thing I was talking about with my mom is it's possible this is actually talking about that rather than the sun itself being divided into a third, that a third of the time it is dark because of atmospheric conditions. That God is laying a darkness over the face of the earth by covering the atmosphere, or again, it's possible that in the wake of the war of the Antichrist, atmospheric conditions are decreased and we get like nuclear winter type conditions. I'm not going to rule out either of these two possibilities because I know that a vision is supposed to represent something. It's not necessarily actually what's happening. It could be representing, symbolizing these different things. So we could read the 3 7s in sequence, or we could see them concurrent, or a mix like my professor wanted to do. But we're getting closer to 8, so I did want to show y'all a little video. The people over at the Bible Project are great. I don't know if any of y'all have ever seen Bible Project. I disagree with their interpretation of the book of Revelation. So if you ever go watch their video on Revelation, I disagree. I have my own tiny little, every theology student's going to have their problem with little things that people do, little nitpicks. But on the whole, I really like basically everything that they make, and they have wonderful summaries of Bible books and things like that. So I 100% encourage people to go to those. But I stole a video from them that I wanted to show.
Do you have volume?
So I don't know if we have volume. Let's see if we have volume.
We figured it out.
Yeah.
The moon turns to blood, mountains crumble, mutant locusts swarm. These are just some of the strange images we find in parts of the Bible called apocalyptic.
And while most people think the biblical word apocalypse means the end of the world, it actually doesn't mean that at all.
So let's talk about how to read apocalyptic literature in the Bible. So wait, the apocalypse doesn't mean the end of the world?
No, apocalypse is a Greek word that means to uncover or reveal. An apocalypse is when you suddenly see the true nature of something that you couldn't see before.
Because I don't always see things the way they really are.
Right. We all develop familiar ways of seeing the world that can limit or blur our vision.
So an apocalypse is like a revelation.
Right. Now, in the Bible, an apocalypse is when God pulls back the curtain to show someone what's really going on in the world from a divine perspective.
For example,
Take Isaiah the prophet. He's suddenly transported in a vision into God's throne room.
oh right, he's in God's temple, described as a bridge between heaven and earth.
And there, God gives him a divine perspective on Israel's past, present, and their future.
So that Isaiah can bring challenge and comfort to God's people in his own day.
Or think about the Apostle Paul, who was trying to stop the movement of Jesus, but then he gets stopped in his tracks by a vision of the risen Jesus himself.
Yeah, he realizes that he's fighting against the very thing that he's been hoping for, and it changes the course of his life.
So these apocalypses give people a heavenly perspective on their earthly situation, and they can give hope, or they can challenge you.
Or make you change everything.
Now, those are biblical stories about people having an apocalypse. There are also whole sections of biblical books where a prophet describes extended apocalyptic dreams and visions.
Like
People call
Ezekiel,
this
would be a
apocalyptic literature.
picture of
And
what
reading
happened in
these dreams
Ezekiel.
and visions is difficult. I mean, they're filled with strange images. Like, let's take Daniel. He sees ferocious beasts coming up out of a dark sea, trampling people on the land. And then a character called the Son of Man is exalted to rule the world. What is going on?
Yeah, apocalyptic literature is written in a poetic, imaginative style, and it's packed with symbolism.
How can I know what these symbols mean?
Well, first, by studying the rest of your Bible. Apocalyptic imagery is based on biblical design patterns that begin in the book of Genesis and then develop throughout the Bible. Like the chaotic sea in the first sentences of the Bible that God tames but doesn't eliminate as he orders creation. And so the sea becomes an image of danger, death, and cosmic chaos.
And the dry land, which comes out of the sea, is the safe, ordered place where humans are supposed to rule as God's image.
Yes, and also on the land are beasts that humans are supposed to oversee. But keep reading, and the humans are deceived by a beast.
And start acting like violent beasts.
Exactly. Now, sometimes a prophet will tell you what a symbol means. Like in Daniel, we're told those beasts symbolize violent human kingdoms. But more often, the authors just assume you know how to trace an image through the biblical story to understand its meaning.
Now let's look at the last book of the Bible, the Revelation, because it's one really long vision. The whole thing is an apocalypse.
Yeah, and it works the same way. It begins with John the visionary transported to God's throne room, where he sees the risen Jesus as the exalted king of the world.
But Jesus is depicted as a bloody lamb.
Right. It's a design pattern, showing how Jesus is the sacrificial lamb from Israel's Passover and from the Day of Atonement. He gave his life for the sins of the world. And then John sees the ultimate beastly dragon, that spiritual power that energizes violent earthly empires. It's cast out by Jesus, the world's true king.
Yeah. Now that reminds me, when I read the Revelation, I'm struck by all this cosmic destruction and violence. I mean, it happens over and over and over.
Yeah, in the Revelation, there are 3 7-part cycles of God's judgment, and it's another design pattern that connects together the stories of the flood, the 10 plagues on Egypt, and the exile to Babylon, and even more. These are moments when humans unleash so much violence and death into the world that God hands them over to self-destruction. It's like a reversal of creation in Genesis chapter 1, as God allows the world and humans to sink back into darkness and disorder.
That's sobering.
It is. But remember, in Genesis 1, God overcame darkness and chaos with his light and light. And so too in the Revelation. The death of Jesus and the death of the world as we know it is the pathway into the renewed creation that began with the resurrection of Jesus.
And so while the Revelation feels like the end of the world,
It's actually about the beginning of the renewed world, where heaven and earth are reunited and God's human images rule all creation in the love and power of God.
okay? This is a lot to take in.
It is. And there's a lot in these books that is still hard to understand, but the purpose of Apocalyptic is really clear. To give us a heavenly perspective on our earthly circumstances so that every generation of God's people can be challenged, comforted, and given hope for the future.
Yeah, those guys are
So
good.
I really like that.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no questions, we can go ahead and dismiss.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Great job.
So next week we'll do chapter 1 and possibly also chapters 2 and 3. So one thing I did want to say is because we can't do this for 22 weeks. I can't do this for 22 weeks. We're going to be talking about kind of what's going on and then hitting on kind of some of the important things. And then if there's a particular thing that y'all are curious about or notice, it'd be awesome if when I say, so like we're going to do 1 to 3 next week, if there's something in there that stands out that's like, okay, I want to ask about that, do so. But we're not going to sit and read every single verse in the whole book. So for example, later when we're going to kind of jump over 14 to 16, we'll kind of skim across it, but we won't necessarily walk through each one. Just keep that in mind. And so if there's something you want to ask about, we can talk about it. And obviously you'll be able to ask questions later, but if we want to talk about it in here, it'd be awesome if y'all came with that. So if you don't
1 through
mind
3 before we
reading
get
1
here.
through 1 through 3 before next week, and write down questions, and just if there's anything y'all want to know about, we'll talk about it.
Cool. Thank you.
And it'll be fun.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
mentioned the
And it
thief
is 8:00.
You mentioned the Thief in the Night series.
I mentioned Left Behind.
Oh, I mean Left Behind, that's
Yes.
what I meant, yeah. And that takes, do you think that was the dispensational premillennial?
Yes, that is definitely made from a
You?
dispensational premillennial
Yeah. Okay.
view, and then a lot of poetic license for the sake of writing stories and an interesting book, or series of books. So he's definitely making stuff up. There's a lot about it that's plausible. There's a lot about it that is fanciful. So I wouldn't say go there for good theology.
But it's really,
But it's an entertaining
But
story.
it's a very,
Yeah, it's
that was back
thought-provoking.
in 1972 when that
Yeah.
was out.
We went to a couple of those seminars.
78.
Tim LaHaye and stuff. That was great. Tim LaHaye. That was in the 80s.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit later.
There we go.
That was great. Good.
Still recording.
Yeah, I trim off the front and back end so we can just.
It was way back then.